So if we circle back to those numbers, we said 2,143 calories. Now that's the amount of calories they need day to day to just stay weight stable. That's their daily energetic needs. That's what they need to stay weight stable. So to bring this person into a deficit, we're going to bring that energy down by 20%. That should be enough to still have good workouts, feel pretty good, pretty energized, but still see a decent amount of fat loss. Hello and welcome to the Smart Strength Training podcast. This is episode 21, and today we're talking about how to ensure you don't regain body fat after a diet phase. If you listened to my episode last time, I'd mentioned at the very end, there are two big fears for anyone that's basically worked their ass off for years to lose body fat and or build a decent amount of muscle mass. The first is, how do I stop dieting and then not regain fat? Today's topic. And the second is, if I stop working out, will I lose all my kind of quote unquote gains? So what I really want to talk about is this idea of getting in shape versus staying in shape. Certainly a little bit in this episode, a lot in the next episode. So today is part one, and we're talking about weight regain. Moving from effectively a calorie deficit to calorie maintenance. This topic comes up on my Q&A, honestly, no word of a lie, every single time that I put it out. But first of all, let's just make sure we're all on the same page before we get going. Hopefully we are all in agreement that to lose body fat, we need to be eating in a calorie deficit for a sustained period of time. As discussed on this podcast before, does not mean that every single day you need to be in a deficit. It means that on average, across the weeks and months, your total energy intake across that time is in a net energy deficit. So I appreciate this is an audio format. I'm going to go through and give you some examples, so you might be worthwhile while writing these down so you can glance at them whilst I talk through it. So there are two popular equations that are used to estimate. And I'm going to say estimate rather than calculate, because calculate makes people believe that this is like bang on 100% correct. But to estimate someone's caloric requirements, they are the Harris-Benedict equation and the Cunningham equation. I am going to be using the Harris-Benedict equation for the sake of this example. So I'm taking a 70 kilo person with a 30% body fat at the start of their diet, and their weight loss goal is 10 kilos. So based on that 70 kilo at 30% body fat, they have an estimated daily energy requirement of 2,143 calories per day on average. Now note, this is based on having light occupational activity, so working, sitting down at a desk, and this person is resistance training 4 times per week using a program where they're focusing on progressive overload, so they're getting stronger or adding reps every week or so. Plus, this person is consuming a diet of high protein at around 1.6 to 2.2 grams of protein per kilo of body weight per day. Now, this part of the topic is kind of key because we need that high protein intake to retain muscle tissue, and we need the stimulus of resistance training for the same reason, because we want to hold on to as much lean mass as possible as they lose weight. I mentioned on the last podcast that during this Ozempic trials, we're seeing a huge amount of weight lost, but a lot of that total weight loss is coming from muscle tissue, as well as a bit of fat loss. And I'll show you why that's a really bad thing to do. I'm not saying Ozempic's a bad thing to do, but anything that you lose weight and a lot of it is muscle tissue isn't a great thing to do. And again, this will become really clear at the end when I highlight the numbers that are different between a weight loss intervention where they've lost a lot of fat mass versus someone that's lost fat mass and muscle mass at the same time. Okay, so if we circle back to those numbers, we said 2,143 calories. Now that's the amount of calories they need day to day to just stay weight stable. That's their daily energetic needs. That's what they need to stay weight stable. So to bring this person into a deficit, we're going to bring that energy down by 20%. That should be enough to still have good workouts, feel pretty good, pretty energized, but still see a decent amount of fat loss. So 20% less than 2,143 is 1,714 calories per day. But a better way of thinking about that isn't necessarily the daily intake, it's going to be the weekly intake. So that gives them a total of 11,998 calories per week. So based on the knowledge that some days you'll eat a bit more and some days you'll eat a bit less. So some days will be 2,000 calories, some days you'll come in under 14,000 calories, but it kind of balances out. Okay, so we think about that. We had a energy requirement to sort of stay weight stable. That was 2,143. The deficit has brought them down to 1,714. So that means that every single day, if they actually create that energy deficit, that works out to be 429 calories in a deficit per day. But of course, we're not thinking about days, we're thinking about weeks. So that lands them somewhere around 3,003 calorie deficit per week, which should roughly bring this person in at around 0.5 kilos of fat loss. Actually, it would come in just under 0.5 kilos of fat loss per week. So let's say this person's highly motivated, they're training and dieting for a specific event like a wedding or a holiday, and it's gone perfectly. So across 14 weeks, based on that half a kilo per week, they've lost 7 kilos. But remember, their weight loss goal was 10 kilos total fat loss or total weight loss. Now, this person is currently 63 kilos, and let's say their body fat percentage is now 26%. We recognize that this lighter frame human being needs less energy at rest. So we're probably going to need to lower their calories a little bit to get that last 3 kilos off. Some people bang on about stubborn body fat. I would really challenge to change that perspective, because weight loss is not linear, and what worked to get the first 5 kilos off probably isn't going to work to get the next 5 kilos off, based on that understanding that a lighter framed human being needs less energy to propel them round. So let's go back to the Harris-Benedict equation and work out their calorie needs now. So based on a 63 kilo person with a 26% body fat level, with the same amount of activity day to day with their job, because they haven't changed job in that time, and they're still working out 4 times per week. That now brings their caloric requirements to 2,065, and therefore a deficit, because you don't want to be eating level, we want to bring them into that 20% deficit. The deficit is now 1,652 calories. So their initial deficit was 1,714, and now it's 1,652, which is just 62 calories per day, but that's actually 434 calories per week, which is enough for someone's weight loss to slow down significantly, and for them to probably get a little bit disheartened and maybe stop because they believe this isn't working anymore. But now they've got their new calories, they know what they're doing. Maybe their motivation is not quite so good anymore. So they now have to continue for an extra 8 weeks to get that last bit of body fat off. So now they're a 60 kilo human being with a 20% body fat. All in, that's taken them 22 weeks to get there. The initial weight loss was across those 14 weeks, but the last part of the weight loss took an extra 8 weeks to get there. So like I said, now we are at 60 kilos with 20% body fat. Now, let's go back to what I said. This person, remember, they resistance train 4 times per week, and I really can't overstress the importance of that, because they started at 30% body fat. So let's compare a 60 kilo person with, rather than a 20% body fat, let's compare this to someone that maybe used Ozempic and just did a load of cardio to lose that total weight. So they've still lost that weight. They're down 60 kilos, but actually because of the amount of muscle tissue they've lost, their actual body fat has gone to 33%. Now that might sound wild, but that's actually not a too exaggerated example of what might happen. So let's go back to the Harris-Benedict equation and calculate some baseline calories, because now, the whole point of this episode is to talk about how to stay weight stable. So both these two people have finished a successful weight loss phase. They are both currently sat at 60 kilos. So we go back to Harris-Benedict. Like I said, we don't need a deficit. We want to aim for this maintenance energy levels. So a 60 kilo person at 20% body fat can consume 2,110 calories per day, or more importantly, 14,770 calories per week. But that same body weight person, but this one's at 33% body fat. Now their daily calorie needs are 1,857 or 12,999 calories per week. That's a whopping 1,771 calories different. That's a huge amount of difference in energy these two people can consume to stay weight stable. So how you lose the weight is vitally important when it comes to the conversation of not gaining body fat back. And what did I say? This person was resistance training. We would ideally want to be doing that 2 to 4 times per week. They were eating a high protein diet. And yes, they can do cardio, but really cardio isn't necessarily your priority at this stage, because you have to move the goal in your mind. The goal is not weight loss. It has to be staying weight stable at the end of that successful weight loss phase. So you do cardio for heart health and you lift weights to make sure you retain as much muscle mass as possible. It's also important to point out, I kept saying retaining muscle mass, because you are very unlikely to gain muscle when dieting. I know some people will say it's hard to know when I've lost weight how much gaining muscle is affecting that scale looking weight loss, because unless you're a complete beginner to resistance training, I would just fully assume that every single thing that you've lost is fat loss and that muscle gain isn't playing into it at all. So let's go back to that example from earlier. This 60 kilo person with a 20% body fat, their energy deficit at the end of their diet was 1,652. But now I just said that we can move their energy intake up to 2,110 kilos per day. So they have the capacity to move up 458 calories per day. Now, this often causes a lot of anxiety. The thought of eating more really worries people, which is why the topic of reverse dieting has become so popular. Now, I'm not going to go into reverse dieting on this episode. I did an episode, I believe it was episode 8 back in March. If you want to find out why I do not recommend and don't think reverse dieting is something you need to do, then go back and listen to that. But what I will just say to continue this is, with the reverse dieting sort of like advocates, they would suggest going up 100 calories every 2 weeks to push slowly up to maintenance. So we've got, let's say, 450, let's say sort of 500 calories that we can kind of push things up. That would still mean an extra 10 weeks of dieting. So I go up 100 calories every 2 weeks. That's going to mean this person has gone from 22 weeks of dieting all the way through to 32. Because unless I get them to their baseline maintenance level, they're still in an energy deficit. So I don't think that's a smart thing to do. So what is a really hard thing for people to hear, and this is maybe going to upset you a little bit, every single person that moves from a deficit to their maintenance will, guaranteed, you're going to gain some weight back. But this is not necessarily fat gain. Let's think about this. By default, you lowered your calorie intake. And I also suggested you're going to eat a high protein diet. So you've got a reduction in calories and you've got to separate a decent amount of those calories for protein, which means that you're going to be affecting your carbohydrate and your fat consumption. So even if you weren't following a low carb diet and you weren't purposefully lowering your carbohydrates only, you still had to lower your carbohydrates to get, or didn't have to, but you're likely to have reduce the carbohydrate intake to create that deficit. Now, what else do we know about carbohydrates? When we consume more carbohydrates, we store glycogen in our muscles, which is another good reason if you retain as much muscle as possible, you've effectively got more space to shuttle that carbohydrate into. But what do we also know? For every one glycogen molecule, we store 3 hydrogen molecules. So that means that water retention in the muscle is going to happen. So when you move from your deficit up to maintenance, there will be an initial weight gain. But that will very likely be water and glycogen gain. One thing I'm acutely aware of, to highlight these points, and hopefully this has all made sense, to highlight these points, I've been using numbers, of course, which implies you have to track, which is not the case. You could just as easily created a deficit by removing high energy dense foods, things like nut butters, unnecessary snacking. You might have reduced from having 3-course meals in restaurants to single courses. How you've reduced your calories. You don't have to be bang on these numbers. I've just used the numbers to sort of show you an example of it. Because all you're really looking to try and do to bring the calories down is to reduce your calories by a little bit to start to see that weight loss. So let's think about now, we're moving into this maintenance. We've lost the weight and we need to take calories up. And we've got, depending on how much weight you've lost, it's going to be somewhere around maybe 400 up to say 600 calories extra per day to play with. Now, as much as I'm fully on board with people not weighing themselves during a fat loss phase, I understand it can be really triggering. I would strongly ask you and suggest that when you're trying to stay stable with your body weight and you're moving to maintenance, that you would want to weigh yourself. Because if you're increasing your food consumption, it's just good to see where your body weight is at. So weighing in maybe 3 to 5 times per week can be or is what I would suggest to do. And as I've already said, we would expect to see the initial weight come up, certainly in the first 1 to 2 weeks. And we're not concerned about that. We're only worrying about the trend over time. And unless you just went back to going full on crazy, poor nutritional habits, eating really high energy foods, you're not going to be in a surplus. And weight gain, as much as people think it happens really quickly, weight gain can happen quickly through glycogen and water storage, but fat gain is actually a lot slower. So I do suggest weighing yourself for probably the first 3 months. I also suggest when we are moving to a maintenance phase that you have some sort of cutoff point. So if you have been going through a period where you're eating out more, you've got house guests come and stay, you've got a holiday, you want to have like an intervention point that you say, I don't want to go above a certain amount. And if I do, I've probably allowed my habits to slip a little bit too much. So if we use that 60 kilo person, they might gain 1.5 kilos of glycogen and water. So you might say, right, I want to sort of stay under 62 kilos. It'd be smart to have a buffer and say maybe 63 kilos. So if they go to over 63 kilos, the nice thing about that is you've only got to do a really short, quote unquote, mini cut to lose a few kilos and get back into that sort of range you want to be. So it's no more than a 4-week sort of diet phase. And I think it's really smart to just make peace with weight stable isn't just like staying bang on the same weight all the time. It's allowed to go up and down a little bit. We all go on holiday. We all have things that mean for a certain period of time, we might be eating a bit more food than normal, which is why that sort of like intervention point and that sort of need to weigh yourself becomes important to sort of manage this. Of course, I've been talking here about nutrition, but you still need to keep exercising. Training is not a fat loss tool. It's something you do forever. Protein, however, I mentioned going up to 1.6 to 2.2. If you've listened to my podcast on protein, I do not think that high protein diets are required long term. So for staying weight stable and for maintenance, we can bring that down more to 1.2 to 1.6. You have that capacity to reduce your protein intake a little bit. If you just like eating protein at that sort of level, you can do, but you do have that capacity to bring it down. So let's just think practically, because you have options here. I said around 400 to 600 calories per day. So you could just move your daily intake up a little bit and then have every day at 400 to 600 calories more. Or you could save that increase in calories for more flexibility for the weekend. Make no mistake that the majority of the habits that you stuck to during your diet phase do need to stay. Let's say maybe you stop putting peanut butter in your protein shake in the shake in the morning because that lowered your calories. You stop buying large tubs of ice cream and switch to having those like Magnum minis in the freezer because that helped with portion control. They are the sustainable habits that you stick to forever. So just because you're at maintenance doesn't mean you don't have to stick to any of those habits that you were going to. Because let's think about it. If this person started at 70 kilos and they were gaining weight, they were massively overeating and have been for a period of time. Now you're a lighter framed human being, so the energy requirements that you have day to day are going to be less. So, as much as eating at maintenance is great, you could eat more food, certainly a decent amount more food than you had in that deficit. It's not the level of energy intake where you can just go completely crazy, or you will end up gaining weight over time, which is why those habits become the cornerstone for anyone's successful weight maintenance plan. And realistically, eating at maintenance is not like nailing that maintenance amount, those 400, 600 calories more every single day. Like your diet phase, you'll have some days where you ate over your calories and some days that you ate under. So there will be days during your maintenance that you actually eat very similar to your deficit. Let's say, for example, you're going out 3 times this week, so you know you've got lots of social occasions that are going to take you into a surplus. If you just ate at that 400, 600 calorie increase every single day, you laid 3 meals on top and you rolled that for 3 weeks, you would find your body weight creeping up over time. So once again, the habits around lowering your energy intake, they're really, really smart to stick to. So be that eating less mini processed food, ensuring large meal volume, prioritizing protein, getting more fiber in. They're not weight loss habits. They are just good nutritional habits ongoing. And one of the things I will always ask my clients when I've been working with them, they've lost the weight and they've moved to a weight maintenance phase, I want to hear what habits they were sticking to or they were doing and created to lower their energy during the diet phase and the deficit. What are they sticking to during their maintenance? And then how are they using the increase in calories? Where are they sort of spending that extra energy? Because reality is like getting to the point that you're eating at energy maintenance is arguably the most important, or certainly the thing that I would want for everyone. I recently did a podcast about the pros and cons of bulking and cutting. And I think that's a valid thing for people to do. But I think for the majority of adults with children, like busy lives, busy business people, eating at maintenance is the most enjoyable, it's the most practical, and it's the most healthy way to eat and to live. And just a final point, that it's okay to gain a bit of weight. Like I mentioned, across busy summers, across Christmas, allowing a little bit of weight gain or expecting it is one thing. So again, having that ability to check in with your weight and having that cutoff point so you can do a short mini cut to bring your body weight back down is all a part of being weight stable. It's not just absolutely nailing those 400, 600 calories and then your body weight never changes. But a 4-week mini cut is much, much more enjoyable than a 33-week progressive 10 kilos or 22 weeks, 10 kilos of weight loss. So hope that gives you some really good tips and pointers for staying weight stable. My podcast next time is going to be all about holding on to your gains in muscle, because like I mentioned, the kind of overall theme of last week and the next 2 weeks podcast is this idea of getting in shape versus staying in shape. So I hope you found this episode useful. And as you may have guessed, this is things I work with my clients with on a daily basis. If you want help, either in a diet phase, transitioning to maintenance phase, I am available for one-on-one training